Welcome everybody to this Black History Month event hosted by the Centre for Religion in Society and the School of Humanities. There are flyers outside if you want to find out about more of our events, and bookmarks as well. Do pick one up on your way out. That is also where the wine reception will be, as well as other drinks. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Anthony Reddie to York St John University. Anthony is the director of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture at Regent's Park College, the University of Oxford. He's also extraordinary professor in theological ethics at the University of South Africa and recipient of the Lanfranc Award for Outstanding Contribution to Education and Scholarship from the Archbishop of Canterbury, Lambeth Awards 2020. Anthony is a participative educator and liberation theologian who specialises in undertaking action research and participative observational work with predominantly poorer Black communities in the UK. He's the author of nearly 20 books and numerous journal articles, and he's also the editor of the journal Black Theology. He's one of the foremost practical Black theologians in the world. And there are very few Black theologians in the UK, so we are very privileged to have him here tonight. He was born and raised in Bradford, so this is almost like a homecoming, but not quite, and then educated at the University of Birmingham. His book, SCM Core Text, Black Theology, which was published in 2012, was the first text that examined Black theology through a participative model to investigate how practical theology impacts Black people in inner city poor communities in Britain. His talk tonight is entitled Dealing with the Two Deadly Deeds, Deconstructing Whiteness and Decolonising the Curriculum. Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you. So on the train up, I had a kind of existential challenge, which was, I've got two versions of this paper. I've got a very, very academic, stodgy version with lots of gratuitous big words, because that's what we academics do. That our general thesis often is that if you can't convince them, confuse them instead. And many an academic theological book has been written on that premise. Or there's a more, I would say, well, popular and accessible version, which is really about my own life and the fact that this is not a new issue. It may be new for many of us, and it may be new post the murder of George Floyd in May 2020, but actually it's not new at all. That's the version I'm going to give you, because obviously the paper's over there and I'm over here. So that's the version I'm going to give. If any of you want the more scholarly version, it will be published in a book coming out next year that I'm co-editing with a colleague. It's called Deconstructing, Whiteness, Empire and Mission. Deconstructing Whiteness, Empire and Mission, published by SCM Press. That's the more academic version with all the gratuitous big words to show you that I'm really clever. However, this is the more accessible version with much smaller words, but hopefully a lot more humorous and a few more jokes than over there. As I said, this isn't new. It may be new for many of us, and there's a lot of performativity since the murder of George Floyd that has suddenly woken us up to something that really has been a phenomena with us for at least, I would probably say, the last 500 years. And according to some scholars, they would go even further back and say, actually, if we're thinking about the construction of a phenomenon called whiteness, so even before people were racialized as white, there was a phenomena that comes out of the continent of Europe that predates the age of discovery, that has helped to shape how we think about the world and who's perceived as normal in it and who is seen as the other or problematic or different. And the way in which knowledge and truth then gets enshrined and embedded within those particular ideas and constructs that have become so normalized that we don't even see it. So actually, one of the best ways of describing this phenomenon actually comes from Willie James Jennings in the formal paper. I quote him all over the place. Willie James Jennings is an African-American historical theologian, post-colonial scholar, and he's brilliant, simply brilliant. I mean, So when I grow up, I want to be like Willie James Jennings, except the fact that he's probably younger than me, which is even worse and more irritating than anything else. And the worst thing about Willie James Jennings is that he's such a nice guy that you can't even hate him when you meet him. You know, like, so you tend to think, I'm going to really hurt you, but you can't because he's such a nice guy. But in his book, his 2011 book called The Christian Imagination, Yale University Press, he outlines the way in which this phenomenon called whiteness, and I'll unpack what I mean by that in a moment, because it's not just about white people. It's about the way in which we think about the world and the frameworks that govern what we think is truth and not, and how those things have been framed within a European mindset of control and mastery over those who are not white. But in that book, and maybe in some other popular talks, Jennings says whiteness is a bit like being in the sea. So whiteness is the sea. And all of us are fish in the sea. And of course, like, there are different sizes of fish. There are some big fish and there's some like sharks that terrorize everyone else. And then there are the little minnows who are all swimming in the sea. The sea becomes so normalized that I would imagine that most fish, with probably the exception of mammals, maybe whales and dolphins, don't give it a second thought. It's part of their reality, that it's so self-evidently what is the world and what is true, that actually the fact that this is a construct, it's not absolutely natural, it's been framed and made up, is something that most of us don't think about, says Jennings. The first moment I knew that this was a thing, even though long before I could put any words to it, I was 17 years old. I had just finished my finished my O-levels. I was starting my A-levels. And one of the three subjects I chose was A-level English. I loved English. And I remember we had to read Jane Austen. Now, at the risk of losing the audience here, because I've done this before, and I know how fiercely people love Jane Austen. So here's the thing, I'm not a great Jane Austen fan. Now, important disclaimer, I'm not saying she's not a great writer. Okay, so, I mean, seriously, as I'll tell you in a moment, people can be really fierce about Jane Austen. But, you know, she's never done much for me, I'll be honest with you. But we had to read her for A-level, so we had to read Emma. So not even one of the really, really sexy ones. It was just this bland thing about this dithering young girl who can't make up her mind in Bath for over 200 pages. It's like, what, you know? Inner city black kid from Bradford was not going to identify with Jane Austen anytime soon, but we had to read her. About halfway through my lower six, my teacher, very, very enlightened guy, very, very progressive for his time, came to me one day in front of the whole class and said, "Anthony, I've got a book for you." I said, "Okay, sir." And he pulled out a copy of Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. Arguably said it wouldn't be the first great African novels. Chinua Achebe is writing about his context in West Africa. I think he's Nigerian. And he's writing about how Africa at that point was being changed as the onset of independence comes. He's writing about his social world. And the teacher, who I shan't name, gives me the book and says, "Anthony, this is a book for you to read." And I thought, "Okay, sir." Now, at one level, I was kind of pleased. I'd literally never read a novel by a black author at that point in the whole of my life. So I'm beginning this book and I'm looking at the author, and on the back there's a picture of him, and I'm looking at him. And at first it's this weird kind of existential, here's a guy who's writing a book, a man of letters, who looks like me. Wow. And then the teacher says, "Well, you know, I really hope Anthony enjoys this book. It will help him enormously to think about himself." And then as the class wore on, and he spoke on about other things, I couldn't quite shake from my mind this basic issue. This was a book for me to read because it was written by a black author, and therefore the only person who could benefit from it was me, the only black kid in this A-level English class. Yet Jane Austen a white author, had to be read by everybody because like, she was on the curriculum. At no point did anyone say, Anthony, is there any relevance to you for this? And I might say, no. Say, okay, I'll tell you what, you can go read a black book and everyone else will read Jane Austen. No. Jane Austen was universal. And at that point, the first thing that hit me at 17, long before I knew anything about colonialism and decolonialism and all the stuff I write about now, was this fundamental question: why was Jane Austen universal? And yet Trini Achebe was a book that was given to me by my teacher, who purchased it with his own money, to be fair, to give to me to read because it would be of benefit to me. I was 17. A few years later, I was at Birmingham University, studying for a degree in church history. And of the 3 years I was there, I was the only black student in the whole of those 3 years, in a curriculum that was manifestly white. All the authors were white. All the way in which we thought about church history was white. And suddenly this issue came back again, but it came back in a different guise, in a slightly different way. This time, in our first year, we were looking at the foundations of church history. And we're looking at some of the key intellectual figures that have helped to shape the thinking around the Christian church and the phenomena called Christianity. And the first person we studied was St. Augustine. And so we poured through his work. We poured through his confessions. We poured through his other work. And I read it and did kind of moderately well. For those of you who are undergraduate students, like the good news is that you're not necessarily defined by how you perform as an undergraduate student. Now, I want to be clear here, do as I say, not as I do, because the truth is I was a lazy git. So I left with a 2-2 that was nearer a third than a 2-1 because I didn't do much work and I spent more time in the bar than I did in the library. So who knew that from that I would end up here as an academic in Oxford University? But I'm not saying that therefore because Anthony Reddie spent all his time in the bar, that means I can do the same. I'm just saying, okay, just saying, do as I say, not as I do. But I was not much of a church historian, it has to be said, in the study. But actually it was years later when I was doing my doctorate that I realized that St. Augustine and a lot of the early church fathers of the patristic period were people of color. Augustine of Hippo, at no point did the lecturer even tell us actually where Hippo was, because that was clearly irrelevant. He was just this genius who wrote this work, and we studied his work with no context to it whatsoever. Years later, I found out that Hippo is kind of perhaps modern day Algeria, so it's North African. But at no point did we ever study him in his context as if somehow being North African had anything to do with his genius or the works of other people like Tertullian and other early church fathers. He was erased. His identity, his cultural identity. I'm trying not to use the word race because that's a modern construct. People would not have understood the construct of race in the time in which St. Augustine lived. But certainly he was not a white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed writer. Same year, but the following term, we studied the Reformation, and particularly Martin Luther. Now, interestingly enough, at this point, context was everything. So we studied Germany, we studied the rivalry amongst like the various German princes. We studied how his context, said the professor, you cannot understand his writings without putting it into context. Well, obviously that's the case for a white person, but we didn't need to do that for Augustine in the previous term. And interestingly enough, Calvin and Luther were never white authors, they were just great authors. Augustine was a great African author, but not even African, just a great author. And at this point, I then began to think, so why is it that context is important in some contexts, in some situations, and not in others? In the first one, we read his work as if it just fell from the sky, as if somehow where he was born and brought up had no significance on the development of his ideas. Yet with the second one, we poured through in exhaustive detail everything that you want to know and probably did not want to know about 16th century Germany. By the time I got to my final year, and so my excuse that I only got a very, very modest 2.2 is not because I was a lazy git, you understand. That's not the takeaway here. It was clearly that I was deeply internally discon something about the course, and I just could not identify with its whiteness. That's the excuse I'm going with now, age 58. It's not because I was lazy, it's because somehow I was just existentially challenged by the whiteness of the curriculum. That's not true. But actually, it was a very, very white curriculum. So my hero, my all-time hero, is James H. Cone, who was the founder, the patriarch of Black liberation theology. We did 3 years looking at the history of Christianity, and we did a whole course where we looked at the phenomena of race and Christianity, and managed to study that without even looking at James Cone. So we looked at Bonhoeffer and Judaism and anti-Semitism. How on earth can you have a course that looks at issues of race, but then not even explore the fact that hidden in plain sight is chattel slavery and colonialism, to which Britain and many of these European countries all participated under the aegis of Christianity? But no, we didn't look at that. We looked at Bonhoeffer and Jewishness and anti-Semitism. Not to say that those are not important things to study, but again, it was still, well, let's find a white exemplar. And the truth is, until quite recently, you could do a whole degree in theology and never study anything written by a non-white person. So when I say that deconstructing whiteness and try to decolonize the curricula is not new, it's not new. For some of it, it's been part of the backdrop of our lived experience for a long time. But I think Willie James Jennings' genius, first in The Christian Imagination, 2011, and then in his follow-up book, After Whiteness, published last autumn, October 2021, After Whiteness, has been to try to wrestle with this phenomena called whiteness. Now, when we talk about whiteness, we're not talking about attacking white people. Now, it's important to say that because I organized a conference last spring called Dismantling Whiteness. Now, here's the irony. I organized a conference with 2 white colleagues. And it was my name on the front, but they're the ones who did the heavy lifting, in fairness to them. And actually, it was one of their colleagues, a white Methodist colleague, who came up with the notion of dismantling whiteness. What was interesting was that all the Twitter trolls and the racism came to me when it was her title, not mine. And it was interesting, at one point, I was in danger of being investigated by the police for promoting racial hatred. So I had a very discreet phone call to say, we hear that you organize a conference called Dismantling Whiteness. As was a check, this is not about attacking white people. I said, well, no, actually, but actually it's a remote conference. There are 30 speakers, of whom 27 are white. So actually, if it is about attacking white people, then the whole set of white people who are turning up who clearly hate themselves and want to attack and dismantle themselves. No, it's not about attacking white people. It is about wrestling with the way in which a phenomena that comes out of European mastery. So one of the things that Jennings and other historians have done is to look at when white people began to travel from Europe into other parts of the world during this age of discovery. They had to take account of why is it that we are like this and other people are different. Up to that point, no one had ever called themselves white, because people were people and their arguments were probably over religious differences and political differences. But when they then began to find other people in other places, and particularly when they needed a justification for engaging in the slave trade, they had to find a rationale for why is it that we want to teach, well, to treat other people as less than at best and as non-human at worst. How can we justify that? The only way we can justify that is by constructing a notion of race with whiteness at the top and black Africans at the bottom and various degrees in between. And race is unstable, it's a made-up construct. There's only one race, that's the human race. If I were so inclined to to walk to the end of the stage and fall off and do myself damage. It's just as likely that a white person sat in the audience could be a blood donor as anyone in my own family, because there's no black blood and white blood. Even though my first day at school, and you really can't make this up, first day at Usher Street Primary School, I'm sat in the classroom, and I will name this guy only because like we're still friends, and in fairness, he's been apologizing for that the last 54 years for this. Of course, I've forgiven him, but of course, I still milk it to get free drinks. So I'm sat, and this guy called Neil Cousins sat next to me, suddenly bites me, and I turn around, and this white kid who's got his teeth sunk into my forearm, which in the context was somewhat ironic because I brought up with the notion that we were the savages. Yeah, he's there taking a chunk out of my arm. And so when I asked him what he was doing, or words to that effect, his response was, I want to see what color blood you have. My nana says that you people have different blood. So red blood's coming out. Because there is no such thing as black blood and white blood. Race is a construct. And we know it's a construct, and we know it's made up because people can't even decide how many races there have been. At one point there were 4, then there were 6, then there were 8, then there were 12. In the Spanish Americas, at one point there were 128 races. It's a made-up construct. But here's the thing, although it's a made-up construct, racism that comes through the way in which policies and procedures, practices and systems are created on the basis of this made-up construct is a thing that makes it very real. Thing that makes it very real. And therefore, one of the things that many black theologians have wrestled with, and maybe it's the question that will come at the end in the Q&A, which Jennings and myself wrestle with, is how do you get to deconstruct race, or well, sorry, how do you get to fight and dismantle racism without reinforcing the construct of race that you're trying to overturn in the first place? Because it can be argued, and although I disagree, I think there's a fair argument to make that one of the problems maybe with black liberation theology that I'm an advocate of is that it still requires a very construct of race that it's trying to deconstruct in order to critique and challenge and dismantle whiteness. Because whiteness is a construct as well. That there are literally no white and black people. There are simply ways of labeling and identifying people based upon, I think, based upon some particular categories. So whiteness as a phenomena has a number of ways in which it can be recognized. Firstly, it's this thing about mastery. Think about how colonialism operates. It operates on the basis that you travel to other people's country and you take over their country and you effect mastery on them. You effect control on them. A few weeks ago, I was with my father in Jamaica. My parents are from the Caribbean island of Jamaica. Jamaica was a crown colony of Britain from 1694 through to 1962. And in all that time, it was run by the British. So the person in charge would have been a governor general appointed by the prime minister and the monarch in London, but dispatched to Kingston in order to keep the so-called natives and the heathens in their place. In order to understand that construct, you have to understand what it means then to have a notion of mastery that says that you have the right to control other people's land and space and to colonize it for your benefit. So first is mastery, that also then sits alongside notions of control. Jennings says, and many other scholars, and I would agree with him, that of course that ethic then, although it comes out of a form of European ideas, then gets embedded in how we think about knowledge. So think about those of us who are academics. Obviously, I cannot possibly talk about Esther, so let me just kind of talk about myself. That probably applies to Esther as well, actually. Is that the further up the academic ladder you go, is the presumption that you are mastering a subject, you are becoming the expert in it, that you are becoming a person whose views and ideas can be taken as legitimate. And for those of you, I mean, I know at least one individual who recently had a doctoral viva, that's where you sit down and really one wants to demystify and deconstruct it. It's that effectively, like, you sit in a room with two other experts who decide if you can be allowed to join the club and become an expert like them. So essentially, you get letters in front of your name rather than letters behind it. That then gives you a level of mastery and control. Now, we know philosophically there are different types of knowledge. We know that there's knowledge that comes out of lived experience, and in many respects, that is perhaps the most significant way in which most of us learn. Most of us learn by experience. I'm 58 years old now. I think back to when I was 18 or when I was 17, when I was first thinking about this stuff. And of course, I have accumulated a whole system of way of knowing that's nothing to do with the formal education I've had. It's just come from being alive and being a human being. But here's the thing, that type of knowledge doesn't have value. I'll put it another way, it doesn't have capitalistic commercial value that then allows you to stand in a place like here as Professor Anthony Reddie, who writes books. If I live to be 100, I will never be as smart as my mom, who left school when she was 14. But here's the thing, she had practical wisdom. And practical wisdom doesn't count alongside epistemology. So I'm a learned person because I know a great deal about quite a small amount of things. That doesn't compare to my mom, who was never an expert, but knew lots of things that I will probably never know. But why? Because one of the cults of whiteness is the way in which like, you then commodify knowledge into hierarchical ways of knowing. So if the difference between the person who can do it but can't explain it, and the person who can explain it but can't do it, who gets the more applause and money, it's the one who can explain it but can't do it. So I can write you a really good book about going on a march and having a community event to bring about change. But that counts more than the person who can actually go out and do the march and bring the people along. Why? Because I've got the qualification and he or she doesn't. That's whiteness. And therefore, it's so insidious. The fact is, all of us get caught up in it. That's why it's so hard to bring about change, even in marginalized places of the world. So coming back from Jamaica, what always strikes me every time I go there, and the same could be same if you went to Africa or you went to various other parts of colonized countries, that long after the colonizers have gone, the ideas of colonization are still embedded. And they're still embedded because they become norms as much as the fish swimming in the sea, as I said right at the start, doesn't recognize that it's swimming in the sea, it's just normal. And so that sense of normality has now become so embedded that it's part of our curricula, it's part of how we teach, it's part of what we learn and what counts as knowledge. It is certainly patriarchal, it is certainly heteronormative, it's certainly class-based. So invariably it is framed through middle-class optics and not through the optics of the poor. And this, as I said, becomes so embedded that actually trying to deconstruct it then becomes really difficult. The best example I've heard about the tension of how you then both expose whiteness and the way in which the curricula has been shaped around it in terms of notions of mastery and control, hierarchy. It's also, as I said, it's invariably always leads to forms of capitalization of knowledge. If the knowledge you have can be, if the knowledge you have can be monetarized, then clearly that knowledge will become valuable. And if it can't, then it will become quaint and exotic. Until it can be. It's very interesting how in many parts of the world you would have folk forms of medicine, ordinary people who were dealing in healing using herbs and using natural substances. And for the most part, that was of no significance except to that group of people who probably used it as a significant way of bringing about healing before Western medicine came. The minute Western medicine finds that you can distill what is the active ingredient in it and then turn it into profitable medicine, suddenly it now becomes really significant. So I still remember sitting with my grandmother who knew there was healing properties in aloe vera. But now, of course, it's been distilled into expensive medicines with patents put on it, and now, of course, it's really important. That is still a phenomenon of whiteness. So how then do we deconstruct that? Well, here's the difficulty. It's become so embedded, and certainly I want to say that theology and religious studies is probably one of the hardest subjects in which to try and deconstruct it, because its penetration into the norm is so deep that the analogy I would use is, as someone who's not a rural person, so please sit with me on this one here. But on the occasions when I was younger, we would go scrumping for apples. Basically, it just essentially, so I got onto someone's land and stealing apples, really, actually. Let's just be honest with you. That's what we were doing. And the thing I still remember was the fact that, like, occasionally, like, you pull an apple off the tree, or maybe pull it off the floor, and it would be bruised. So clearly, like, you're not going to eat the bruised bit because it didn't taste very nice. So you try to cut away the bruised bit in order to have what is left is an edible apple. But what happens if the apple is sufficiently bruised that once you cut away all the bits of it, you really haven't got much left? That, I think, is the danger that many centrists have. Obviously, there are a lot of people on the political right who are not interested at all in decolonizing knowledge, that they will attack it as being woke. But for those who maybe are not so conservative, but maybe are in the center, a bit kind of pragmatic, they'll say, but Anthony, but what happens if we try to rethink our curriculum? If we try to ask questions about who gets taught and why we teach them? Why is so much of our knowledge hierarchical and centered on European tropes and ideas? If we try to take that away, well, two things will happen. Firstly, a lot of people who have become experts on their subject will suddenly feel destabilized, because suddenly they will either have to learn new stuff. I still remember a lecturer in an institution I shan't name who admitted that when he came out to give a lecture on a certain subject, he'd be using the same notes for 30 years. And you knew he was using the same notes for 30 years because, like, the paper had gone all yellow. He conquered his knowledge to the point whereby he might have read some new books, but he wasn't going to change that lecture because he had created a form of mastery and control over it. And the truth is, like, for those of us who have become so-called experts in our subject, part of the threatening nature of decolonizing, of moving some subjects to the margins and moving other subjects to the center, is that it might force some of us to have to go away and learn some new stuff. And the truth is, and I don't want to disillusion anyone here who's on the process of coming to an academic, to be an academic, but the truth is, actually, once you get your PhD, like, you never learn quite as much afterwards as you did in the moments actually leading up to it. And why? Because actually, in the moment leading up to it, what you're still trying to do is to prove yourself. To say, actually, am I really good enough to be in the club? Once you're in the club, it's like, yeah, you know. I mean, I'm in the club now. And the more distinguished you get, like Professor Anthony Reddie, it's like, well, to be honest with you, it's going to be a brave man who's going to turn up and say, Anthony Reddie doesn't know what he's talking about. I dare them to try. I'm just saying, I mean, I dare you to try that. So therefore, you kind of get naturally complacent. You've become an expert. People defer to you. People ask for your opinion. People put in research grants and they ask you to referee it. Are you really learning substantive new stuff? Actually, probably not. So here's the thing. Even as I talk about decolonizing and deconstructing the curricula, I know that I'm also putting my own mastery and importance at risk, which is why there's not a lot of appetite from black or white academics in order to do this. But actually, it needs to be done, because what we have to acknowledge is that because what we perceive as truth, what we often talk about epistemology, has been so shaped by this construct of whiteness, it isn't really fit for purpose, if we're honest. Jeremiah Wright Jr., who is a well-known African-American theologian, pastor, black liberation theologian, he has this wonderful metaphor, which I'm going to borrow. I'm borrowing it because I've named him, so I'm not stealing it, I'm just saying. He says, imagine that you're going to make a cake. And you get a big bowl and you throw all the ingredients in there and you mix it all up like to make a cake and you put it in the oven and it comes out. It looks beautiful. And you let it cool, you take a slice to give it to your guests. And you realize to your horror that when you were putting all the mix into the bowl, you didn't put any sugar in it. So it tastes pretty bland. So, okay, so how then do you remedy it? So you think, okay, wow, you know, I've got a big cake. Don't really have time to start over again. I know I should, but I just can't be bothered. I know what I'll do. I'll put as many sweet things on top of the cake as I can. So I'll put on a layer of marzipan. And then I'll put on maybe some icing sugar. And then I'll put on some sprinklers. And I'll put on some Smarties. And I'll put on some other sweet confectionaries. Pile it onto the top of the cake. Then cut it and then give it out to people. Well, two things happen, he says. Firstly, actually, the truth is most of the cake still doesn't taste that nice, but like you get a little bit of a sugar rush from the small part that has the sweet stuff piled on top. But fundamentally, he says, the real problem with that is that after a while, maybe people say, you know, like the cake ain't that bad really, to be honest with you. You know, I mean, if you eat it with a very sort of strong, sweet cup of tea, you know, actually, it didn't taste so bad. So I tell you what, let's just scrape all this additional stuff off because it's kind of getting in the way. Just scrape it off. He says oftentimes when we talk about diversifying the curriculum, which is actually what is tending to happen in many places, in my own place in Oxford University, I'll say nice things about them because it's been recorded. It's interesting in that what they have done is to diversify. So they have encouraged and allowed me to have a course on James Cone. I'm thrilled to have it. I can't wait to teach it. So we will do a course on James Cone next term. The truth is that doesn't change the fact that the rest of the curriculum is still overwhelmingly white. It just means that some people actually will get a little slice with a bit of sugar on top. And so what has happened in many places is not the decolonization of the curriculum, which is really, if you're taking it seriously, what you have to do is to take it apart and say it's not fit for purpose and let's start again. And let's this time ask ourselves what should have been in the mix in the first place. And actually what should be in the mix in the first place, particularly thinking of it as a theologian, is the fact that Christianity was always diverse. If you simply look at the Acts of the Apostles, it tells you it's diverse because all the people of the known world were there when God, through the Holy Spirit, was doing God's thing. It tells you it was diverse because actually, if you look at the first 3-4 centuries, they're African centuries in terms of the writings and their ideas. But of course, what whiteness did was to erase the voices of diversity. And of course, and I said whiteness as a construct is very male. So of course, it also takes out all the women's voices. It takes out the fact that in the early church and the early construction of the faith, it was women who played a key part. We can see it in the scriptures, but we simply erase it from our curriculum. So in Oxford, prior to my course on James Cone, is this provision called Special Theologians, which starts with Origen and ends with Karl Rahner. Now, there's not one woman involved, because clearly women have never written anything worth reading whatsoever in academic theology. Obviously, I'm being ironic. I'm just in case of, you know, like we have to go out for a meal afterwards, so in case like she stabs me with the fork. I'm being ironic. But think about it. How can you get to a major university in 2022 and still have a curricula that has not one woman in it, not even Julian of Norwich, not even like the token woman who sounds like a man, not at all. Because whiteness has been this construct. So decolonizing is going to be difficult. Therefore, pragmatically, although I think that's what we should do, I think realistically, I'm certainly up for two things I want to say very quickly there before I close. First, it is about diversifying the curriculum. But diversifying is not just adding new things to it, because the argument against that is always, well, our curriculum is full already. If we add something to it, what then do we take away? And then you then get into all the culture wars. So another way of doing it is to say there is always contestation in how we think about even what we say are abstract intellectual subjects within the existing curricula. There are always issues of contestation around how we see and how we understand and what we think is true. And why? Because that's human nature. Human nature is always full of contestation. There's no one context, no matter how homogeneous we think it is, where a group of people all agree and there's no disagreement of the various ideas that are shaping their way of living. So two very quick examples. One is obvious, one not so obvious. First obvious one is Christology. In academic theology, the study of Jesus. From the earliest times, what Jesus looked like was of hugely political significance. It's no accident that we've ended up with a white Jesus that's been shaped across empire, because if God, who's revealed in this person called Jesus, looks like you, then that then gives you permission to go and oppress all the people who don't look like Jesus, i.e. and look like you. So actually, you have to get into big questions of whiteness to ask a question around why is a white Jesus so significant? And why is his Jewishness almost utterly obliterated from all our theological thinking about it? I still remember doing a workshop in a part of the world that I shall not name because it's been recorded, with a group of Methodist local preachers. Now, to be clear, as a Methodist, these were good people, and I would suspect if I went to another church, like my friend called Matt, so if I went to a Baptist church, I suspect like they might say the same thing, although Matt will say, no, like we would never have said that. So anyway, so I did this workshop with them, and I said, so who is Jesus for you? And for the picture of Jesus, I used this image that came from a BBC program about 20 odd years ago called The Son of Man. So the Son of Man, which some of you may have seen, was 3 Sundays that ended on Easter Sunday. And its conceit was that this is a first century skull from modern day Israel. And we can date it to around the time when Jesus was supposed to have lived. So what if it were the skull of Jesus? They said, we're not saying it is, but what if it were? And then over 3 weeks, what they did was 2 things. One is that they had an archaeological paleontologist who kind of rebuilt the face. And then alongside that, then it's like we told the story of Jesus using both the Gospels and other historical material like Josephus. So the end point when they said, ta-da, and its great reveal is, this is Jesus. And what you have, and actually if you go to Google and type in Son of Man, Jesus, what you get is this first century artisan, a Jesus with a beard and looking very Jewish. He doesn't look like the Bjorn Borg, which is like the Jesus that I grew up with in Eastbrook Hall in Bradford, who look more like Bjorn Borg than Bjorn Borg looks like Bjorn Borg. Now, here's the thing. I'm glad you laughed. I tried that with the class last year in Oxford, and all of them looked and said, but who's Bjorn Borg? Clearly, I need new material here. Obviously, he was a big, fantastic tennis player in the 1970s. But he was very blonde and very blue-eyed with a wonderfully styled beard. That's the Jesus I grew up with, not this Jesus. So when I said to the group, is this Jesus for you? They said, no, 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 no. I said, why not? First, they said he's too ugly to be Jesus. Because obviously Jesus had to be blue-eyed and blonde-haired with a Remington beard trimmer. Obviously that made his beard just look, But secondly, and this is the more scary one, he's too Jewish, they said. Too Jewish. Yeah, too Jewish. But what they meant was, this is not the Aryan Jesus that Christian theology and mythology has created over the last 1,000 years. A Jesus that is embedded in whiteness and upholds empire and justifies the stealing of people's land. And this is Jesus has no problem having a slave ship named after him called the slave ship Jesus. So therefore, at the very least, when we're teaching Christology, the very least we can do, given how diverse the world is, and given that we're still wrestling with issues of race and class and sexuality and identity, is to at least be honest that there's always been a contestation around who is Jesus for us. And why is it that a black Jesus is unpopular even in black communities themselves? Years ago, working as a lay worker in 2 Methodist churches, my parting gift if I was going to leave and go do my doctorate was that I decided that I would give them a black Jesus. So I went to, at the time, like the only black cultural bookstore in Birmingham, bought a picture of a black Jesus, decided that I would sneak into the vestry on the Saturday and take down the white, blue-eyed, blonde-haired, beyond bald looking version and stick it on the wall. Now, here's a tip for all of you who have gone into ministry. If you're going to do something subversive, don't tip them off before you do it. So my mistake was to tell them that like this white Jesus was not the one they should be worshiping. They should be worshiping a black Jesus. And they all looked at me and said, no, that's Jesus for us. Anyway, so I took down the white Jesus, put the black Jesus in, put the black Jesus up, put the white Jesus in the boot of my car, drove home. Clearly, I had not thought this through. So Sunday afternoon, I get a deputation of matronly, fierce-looking black women. All of them turn up at my flat. The lead one called Mabel, and it's a woman you do not argue with. And Mabel said, Anthony, give him back. I said, I don't know what you mean. She says, don't let me come in and box you down, boy. Give him back. And I said, oh, okay. So I went out and took the white Jesus, and she literally threw the black Jesus at me. He's no use to us, she says. Picked the white one up and said, oh, there, you naughty, you wicked boy, she said. And they got in the car and drove back. This is a black church that had predicated their faith on a white Jesus that had been taught to them by colonialists that become so embedded that even when a fellow black person is trying to say to them, but this isn't the salvific figure that is helpful for your existential identity, they wanted no part of it. Final story very quickly. I did work for a year at a Baptist seminary in Bristol Baptist College. And at the time when I worked there, obviously mainly students training for Baptist ministry, the film Selma came out. So I insisted that we have a group visit to watch the film in order to do some theological reflection on it afterwards. And the point I said to them was, I said, this is an intra-Christian argument. It's not a case of Martin Luther King's a Christian and he's fighting some godless, secular humanists. That all the people who are fighting for segregation are Christians like him. And at the heart of it, certainly understanding Baptist theology, are theologies of election. Something we teach often in sort of systematic theology. What does it mean to be elect? There's no church whose official position is that everybody will get saved. Even in Methodism, I'm going to say this like for the benefit of the Methodists who are watching this show. I'm still a good Methodist. That in Methodism, like we have what's called a four alls. All can be saved. I mean, that's an important concession. It's the belief that God, grace will not just touch some people. Everyone potentially can be saved. But the second one says, yeah, but everybody needs to be saved. Everybody can be saved to the uttermost, and everyone can know that they're saved. So other way around, everyone can know that they're saved, and they can be saved absolutely. But here's the thing: the second one is the key one, because in traditional Methodism, we still say, as inclusive as we are, that unless you believe in the saving work of Jesus Christ, you will not be saved. You will not go to heaven. So here's the thing: every branch of Christian theology has some notion of election, some notion that God is making a choice. But of course, what we see is that theological idea then, when get allied to issues of white supremacy and power, turns itself into social policy. You see it in apartheid in South Africa, and you see it certainly in the southern states of America, and you still see it there now in terms of people who would support Trump. That it's usually a hop, skip, and a jump from God chooses some people to God just happens to choose the people who will look like us and reinforce our social view. I don't think it's that hard to teach that form of contestation within a curricula, given that if you are studying a course in Christian theology, perhaps less or religious studies, but a course in Christian theology, at some point you will study something about election. So what does it mean for God to make a choice? James Cone's argument is that God makes a choice, but God is not choosing white racist people. And it's interesting at that point, white evangelical students get up in arms. Oh, it's terrible. How can you say that? How can you say God's going to make a choice? Yeah, but in your theology, like, you believe some people are going to go to hell. It's just, the truth is, actually, as long as it's not people who look like you, then you don't really mind. So therefore, there are still ways of beginning to decolonize the curriculum, not in the absolute purity sense, but just to say, how do we build contestation, to acknowledge that there are always arguments, there are always fierce debates, and those debates often have a way of linking issues around worldviews, ideology, politics, culture, issues of identity, issues of social location. They're invariably built into theology, even the things that we think are abstract and are apolitical. So in conclusion, very, very quickly, this isn't new. It's been an issue for a long time, but the truth is, most white people, most relatively conservative, particularly male, heteronormative men perhaps. So I think feminism and womanism has had some insight into this, simply because of the way in which whiteness is often conflated with patriarchy. Finally, we're waking up to this. I want to end with the words of my favorite writer, which is James Baldwin, who says this. He says, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for sharing with us your personal journey and your insights into what it really means to dismantle whiteness and decolonize the curriculum, and the importance of doing so. We do have some time now for questions, and there will be somebody with a microphone to come round. If you could wait for the microphone before you ask a question, just because we also have viewers online and they won't be able to hear what the question is if you don't use the microphone. Thank you very much. Who would like to kick off? Yep, James, thank you.
Thanks very much, Anthony. That was wonderful. I was really struck by what you said about how people in positions of defining the curriculum end up having to give up their own kind of personal safety. And it made me think of James Baldwin, actually. And when one of my favorite things he ever wrote was, true change only comes about when we give up safety, our own safety. So my question is simply, how do we encourage people in the status quo to give up their own safety and to genuinely pursue true change?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most important things I've learned in my own journey has been about who are our dialogue partners. Who are the people you are connected to? And to what extent are you connecting yourself with people who will challenge your worldview and challenge the things that you think are axiomatic? So I've got two examples, which are both similar, but one is a story I've heard and one is personal. So the story, very quickly, is the birth of womanist theology. So for those of you who don't know, it's this birthing of Black liberation theology that comes out of women's experience. So James Cone, early work, and I encourage you to buy my book, actually called Introducing James Cone, SEM Press, very accessible price of $15.99. Anyway, Cone's early work is patriarchal. Cone will talk to everyone except Black women. So he talks to white racist men, he talks to white liberal men and some white progressive men. He even talks to white women. So there's an early conversation with Rosamund Radford Ruther in 73, 74. But he ain't talking to Black women. Talks about his mother, who's called Lucy. My mum was called Lucy. Loves his mother, Lucy, but doesn't talk to Black women. So this wonderful quartet of women, Jacqueline Grant, Dolores Williams, Katie Cannon, and Kelly Brown Douglas, they march into his office one day and they confront him. And they say, "Professor Cone, you're sexist." Now, you know, if you ever met James Cone, that takes plenty of chutzpah to go into his office and tell him that to his face. But Cone, to his credit, says, "You know something, you're right. That's the theological work you need to do." And the most convincing part about that learning is that when he then does the 20th anniversary of his book, A Black Theology of Liberation, first published in 1970, then there's a 1990 version. In the afterward, he has this whole section where he invites the womanists to come and says, in my early work, the first version I wrote came out in 1970, I had no conception of womanist theology and women's issues. I've since learned, and now in this published version, he acknowledges his own limitation, acknowledges his limitation around not thinking more about class, and he needs to dialogue more with Latin American scholars and think about class, and certainly did not mess with any issues around sexuality. So it's about who are our dialogue partners, and having the courage not simply to learn and to integrate them into your existing work, is to say that actually to take that work seriously, what then needs to change in my work. And certainly in my own experience, this wasn't so much a scholarly moment. Years and years ago, again, I say as a Methodist, not to attack the Methodist Church, just because, you know, I mean, I'm a Methodist. I was on our doctrine committee, the Faith and Order Committee, back in the late 90s. And it was interesting, and again, I don't want to say too much because I don't want to out anyone or embarrass anyone, but it was very male, very, very male. I just got my PhD, and literally the week after my PhD, the week after news of my PhD had been published in our church newspaper, I got the call to come and join the doctrine committee, because now clearly I was a grown-up academic who can now sit with the greats and debate academic theology and doctrine, because I was Dr. Anthony Reddie, not just Mr. Anthony Reddie. So I go with the big boys. And it's very patriarchal. And I remember sitting in the bar afterwards of the residential centre where we were, and a feminist scholar taking me to task. She said, oh yeah, but you know, it's very patriarchal and sex. And I said, yeah, it's terrible. And I said, yeah, but I didn't see you the ones complain about it. It's interesting how the chair, who was always a former president of the conference, never saw my hand, but saw your hand lots of times. But at no point did you ever either critique him for not seeing me, or did you ever say, actually, maybe I've spoken enough, because quite frankly, Anthony, you know, like, you're a sexist git and you like the sound of your own voice, which of course is undoubtedly true. So then I had to, and things she said I've never forgotten. She said, fighting against patriarchy is not the job of women. That's what men should do. Fighting against racial justice is not what, fighting for racial justice is not what black people should do. That's what white people should do. Fighting against heteronormativity isn't what queer academics should do. That's what those of us who are so-called straight should be doing. In terms of giving up privilege, it's not just allowing people to sit at the table. It's about then reconfiguring how the table's even set up in the first place, and why is it that some voices are heard and some aren't.
Thank you. Do we have another question? Yeah, Pauline.
Oops. Thank you, Anne. Yes, thank you, Anthony, for that brilliant talk. Very inspiring and challenging. I wanted to pick up on the point that you said about, which I totally agree with, that of course it's really our wonderful academic expertise and knowledge that has currency, I suppose, and that might be financial currency, but also academic currency. But there are academic practitioners amongst us, aren't there?
Yeah.
And I'm quite interested to hear a little bit about how you connect with academic practitioners yourself, because I imagine you are an academic practitioner from what you've said, and how really is it so important to always be trying to impress academia in its wonderful way, which is very important, as opposed to actually wanting to bridge the divide between practitioners, policymakers, and academics? Thank you.
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think in a moment of candor and disclosure, which is kind of what I do anyway, but you know, I still remember. So in my former life, I was a community worker in Handsworth. As I said, I had to work for these two churches, and part of what wanted or inspired me to become an academic was the way in which I would meet people who are outside of the area where I was working, and they had read books, and they would come on fact-finding tours and visits. And I would share with them my experience. And because I hadn't written it down, clearly it wasn't to be believed. So at one level, it wasn't necessarily about becoming an academic. It was simply wanting to have a level of authority that then said, well, actually, next time you come and you talk to Dr. Anthony Reddie, who studied at the University of Birmingham with the great John Hull, and those of you who know anything about practical theology and religious education will know what an icon he is, then that's like you'll take me seriously. But of course, what happened is that once I got into the study of it, and then I began to give my first papers and teach my first classes, and find actually, I quite like this gig. The truth is, it's a lot easier than being a community activist. So I just jumped the paradigm, I just went. And for a number of years, did not want to go back because much like the class-based internal snobbery, one of the great snobs I meet in my time in Oxford are not the ones who come from generally posh backgrounds, are the ones who were kind of, let's say, so one generation ago, like the working class, but now the middle class. And part of their internalization is that, like, they don't want to be reminded where they came from, so they become almost hyper-vigilant on policing rules because they feel embarrassed. But that was me, I was a super academic because I was conscious of the fact that I had not had the classical journey into academia as other people had. Those people got first and then got scholarships and did MAs and then got postdocs and stuff. I didn't do any of that. So really, it took about 7-8 years for me then to be comfortable enough to say, actually, I haven't outgrown this, and why should I outgrow it anyway? There is still something about knowledge that comes from an embedded experience of people who, to use this fancy Gramsci term, are kind of organic intellectuals, people who are in the community, and they have a huge amount of skill. Now, one of the things that I think has been really good to see has been development of sort of professional doctorates, that are ways in which practitioners can still remain practitioners, but at least learn, I think, sort of research skills and learn a particular form of language that they can deploy. So one of the things that we know that is always an advantage, both in class and in terms of race, is this notion of code switching. But actually, one of the things that you learn when you go from one world to another world is that in order to be heard, you have to speak in a particular way. Now, part of me says, I hate it, but that's just a reality. So I'm not the same kid from East Bowling, Bradford. I've learned to speak in a particular way in order to be heard. But the thing is, actually, when I go back to Bradford, I can flick back to my former self. That's code switching. The ones who can't do the code switching will live in their community, but never get heard outside it. And so part of what I'm very, so in theology, like we have a professional doctorate, which is not everyone's cup of tea. I accept that. But I think one of the great things about it is that it is allowing people who really have no predilection to be theorists on a full-time basis to be able to say, but as a really good practitioner, I can explain my practice. I can analyze it and deconstruct it for you if that's what you want. I can play that game, but I'm still embedded in it as a practitioner. And so there's something about how we hold those two things together and acknowledge that there are ways of knowing in community that are not better or worse, they're different. And the fact that there's not a commercial value to it doesn't mean it's not important. And I still try to engage with that, but also, and I think the final thing to say is also to be honest. That when I engage with it and I go back as someone who is choosing to make that choice alongside people who are probably in a community who don't have the choice. And then secondly, I do it still from a position of power and privilege. That yes, I can turn up, and those who know me, and I said this in an email. So when I was asked, how do you want to be described? And I said, just call me Anthony. I'm only professor to the people I don't like. So just call me, and seriously, just call me Anthony. But even when I say that, I know in brackets that there's still the professor tag I can pull out anytime I like. So So I think we also have to be honest about how we make that journey and not fool ourselves that somehow we have not changed and somehow like we're still the same person, because like we never are.
Thank you, Anthony. If I could end by asking you to be prophetic. I'm wondering how you feel about the future and where we are now. So after the death of George Floyd, places like the University of Oxford took it upon themselves to appoint a Black professor, and all institutions, universities came out with statements saying we support Black Lives Matter. Since then, we've had what was labelled as the most diverse cabinet in government, and yet that same cabinet, those same government ministers have been referring to the Race Equality Charter as being too woke, and one particular education secretary actually wrote to universities telling them to consider the Race Equality Charter membership carefully because it might be a restriction on freedom of speech. So how do you feel now about the future direction in terms of dismantling whiteness, decolonising the curriculum?
Yeah, so two very, very quick thoughts. One comes from, I think it's a quote that comes from Soren Kierkegaard, who says that life is lived forwards but understood backwards. So there's a sense in which actually none of us know actually whether this is a kairos moment and it's a pivotal moment of change, or whether it's just a blip. Actually, history will judge us on that. So I genuinely don't know. At one level, I know I've had conversations I have waited 25 years to have with friends and colleagues, and that's great. And certainly I can think of one society I won't name where I gave a paper in 2007, and it was horrendous. I mean, I literally was booed off the stage, literally booed off the stage. They invited me back and I gave a paper to that same society earlier this year, and they applauded me off. Largely the same people. So it could either be, as I said, it could be a kairos moment, a moment where God is breaking through. Obviously, I said this as a theologian. Or it could be a blip. That's the first thing. Secondly, another quote actually comes from Zora Neale Hurston. This is one of my favorite writers. She was an African-American writer, folklorist, poet, short story writer. And in the 1930s, she said this, she says, "Not all kinfolk are skinfolk." No, sorry, I was around, sorry. Butchered that quote. Okay, start again. Not all skinfolk are kinfolk. Not all skinfolk are kinfolk. And what she really means by that is the issues of class and ideology are hugely important. Just because you look like someone doesn't mean that like they're necessarily on your side. So in terms of the Conservative Party, it is diversity. Yes, absolutely, it is absolute diverse. But diversity and social justice are not the same things. So what you have are very privileged men and women whose background comes from the colonies, but of course, even the colonies, not all people have the same positions. There are those who are happy to collude with and to benefit from colonialism, and there are those who weren't. That's always been the case. So therefore, yes, do I think the diversity is a good thing? Yes, I do. But in the end, they're still pursuing policies that are about upholding the status quo. They're still punishing the poor. They're still supporting the rich and the privileged. I think one of the quotes that James Cone says, he says, in many of our societies, we have a way of praising upwards, but blaming downwards. That's what the Conservative Party historically have done. And the fact that there are Black and Asian people now in position of power doesn't change the fact that their underlying ideology is still the same. Therefore, as a liberation theologian, one of the key things I've always believed in, I think even more so now, is a notion of coalition building. How do you find allies and help us to see, well, help all of us to see that we're more alike than unalike? That racism and homophobia and classism and sexism, they're not the same things, but they have similar ways of operating. And the people who benefit and win from it are usually the ones who then play divide and rule and get the other groups to fight amongst themselves for the scraps, whilst they sit in a position of comfort and power then demonising everyone else. You know, I mean, that was Brexit. You know, I mean, it broke my heart to go back to East Berlin, where I come from, and to see white working class kids I grew up with saying, but like, we need to vote for Brexit in order to have stronger barriers. And you say, well, why? Oh, because, you know, because like we have to look after our own. And you say, but who are our own? You know, I mean, all of us went to school together in Bradford. And the thing I remember was that all of us were poor. White working class were poor, black migrant communities were poor. We were all poor and together in the same comprehensive school. But of course, what divide and rule does is that it, and let's face it, that's identity politics. That the people who said they hate identity politics only hate it when other people do it. So actually, when it's identity politics around whiteness, you then get people then voting for policies that are inimical to their own progress because they've been fooled. But the truth is, you can't fool people who don't want to be fooled.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for your generosity in sharing your thoughts and your knowledge and answering questions. We will have to stop now because we're out of time. However, I'm hoping that drinks have arrived in the atrium and we can carry on the conversations there, and Anthony will be around for a while. So if you have a question you haven't asked and you want to catch Anthony in the atrium, please feel free to do so. Thank you very much.